Know your rights. Stand strong. Claim your rights. You have the right to education.
Jy het die reg op gesondheidsorg.
You have the right to freedom of expression.
Jy het die reg om jou werk te kies en billik betaal te word.
No one can force you to work against your will.
Geen discriminatie, geen uitzonderings niet. U hebt die recht op gelijkheid. These are your rights. Shaki Sizwe, Bodhi Nasi, Build a Nation, every weekday from 12 to 2 p.m. on Bush Radio 89.5 FM.
And welcome back. You're still tuned into Sakisi's We're Building the Nation, Bodhi Nasi. So again, welcome to today's important discussion on police brutality and misconduct, a critical human rights issue that affects communities and justice systems across the globe. So law enforcement exists to protect and serve. However, when officers misuse their authority through excessive force, racial profiling, corruption, or even abuse of power, the very principles of justice and equality are undermined. And police misconduct does not only conflict harm on individuals but also fractions of public trust and weakens the social contrast between citizens and the state. So in many countries the issue is systematic, which basically is shaped by historical inequality, institutional bias, lack of accountability, and also cultural norms that protect rather than punish abuse. But across the world there is growing demand for reform, transparency, and also justice. And today we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts to explore the reforms needed to end police brutality and also build fairer systems that truly uphold human dignity. And today we are joined by the Western Cape Provincial Police Ombudsman, Major General Oswald Reddy, and Brenda Leonard from Bush Radio. So, good afternoon. I hope everyone is well. General Reddy, let's just start with you. So, from your oversight position, like what forms of police misconduct do you encounter most frequently in the Western Cape beyond physical excessive force, such as psychological intimidation, for instance, discriminatory profiling, evidence tampering, or even corruption? If you can just elaborate a little bit further on that.
Good afternoon to the hosts and also to the listeners out there and my fellow panelists. Greetings. My name is Oswald Reddy and I'm the Western Cape Police Ombudsman. When we talk about police brutality and we talk about issues relating to torture, etc., it is really a very difficult question. And if we look at what's happening and what is being exposed currently in both the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry and we look at what is being revealed in the Parliamentary Ad Hoc Committee, looking into General Mkunade's allegations, it shows us that there's a serious concern about the levels of violence in the society and the response from the police in terms of how the police are engaging with the ordinary citizens, the rank and file. Remember, the police have certain powers in terms of the law. However, they have to respect human rights and human dignity and carry their duties out in a fair, responsible, reasonable manner, taking into account the human rights culture. So the problem occurs when there's misuse and abuse of policing powers. When you have a situation where no force is utilized, if someone is undertaking an arrest, if a person needs to be arrested and the person submits to the arrest, then there's no need for the use of force. Sometimes when you're working in a place like the Western Cape, specifically the Cape Town itself, where you have gangs and violent criminals confronting and engaging police officers, they have the right to defend themselves and they have the right to protect the community, firstly life and thereafter property as well. So in engaging and confronting that, there are certain instances where violent force is used against the police and the police then have to defend themselves. But the law requires that the force must be reasonable. The moment the threat is neutralized, the level of force and aggression must then also be reduced. So it depends on what you're dealing with, and it's situational awareness on how you're confronting what is in front of you. So the reality is there, that there's misuse and abuse of policing powers by a handful, I would say. In terms of my office, we deal mainly with police inefficiencies. We do not investigate criminal conduct of police officers. That is dealt with by IPID, and IPID stands for Independent Police Investigative Directorate. So any actions by police officers that results in a crime will be investigated by IPID. On the other hand, when we get police inefficiency complaints, we sometimes pick up that there's allegations of torture or police brutality. We would then do a referral. Firstly, we will inform the complainant that you need to go to the police station and open a case, or we will do a referral to the Provincial Commissioner of the Police, where we'll indicate to them that this individual alleges that he or she has been tortured whilst being arrested, or looking for drugs, or looking for a firearm, etc. We have about 14 cases on record currently that I'm aware of, where we do a referral, and many times we also refer cases to IPID directly, so that they can look into the challenge around police brutality and misconduct by police officers.
Thank you so much for answering that. And Brenda, just to sort of like involve the media aspect when it comes to covering police violence, how does media tend to contextualize these stories as exceptions to the rule or as symptoms of deeper systemic problems? Because we know that violence can sometimes stem from, let's say, racism or due to cultural norms. So how does this frame influence the public consciousness and demands for change as well?
I think the media has a role to inform. But when they're informing the audience or the communities, it needs to, the same media ethics need to be applied. So you need to be fair to both parties or all the parties involved. You need to be balanced in your reporting. Because we have influence as media, we need to move away or try not to put blame in sometimes very high emotional situations. So that for me is the role. But I think on the other hand, we had a situation where there was an active crime scene opposite Bush Radio. We sent the news, go cover it. And then the police officers actually told the journalists they can't cover it. And I went out and I spoke to them. I said, listen, we have the right to cover the story. We're not interfering with your crime scene. We're outside of your crime scene. You cordoned it off. We're outside the cordon and we have a right to report what we see. And they weren't happy about that. But what we've done since then is we've actually approached the police station commander and said, listen, this is the incident. We would like to make you aware this is what the law says. And he then used that to educate the police on the media and the media's role. I think there was a situation where the police officers, the ordinary, as you call, rank and file police officers, didn't necessarily know the law and how to engage the police. On the other hand, I've seen journalists inside the crime scene, and my thing is that's not your role. You're not investigating. You report outside of the crime scene. There was a situation, a shooting in Rocklands one day, and they cordoned off the area, and because maybe they did some education in terms of the media, they opened the cordon, come inside, and I'm like, but no, that shouldn't be happening. So I think on the one hand, the media must know their role and what they can and can't do and what they shouldn't do at the crime scene as well. Because ultimately we're there to tell the story. So tell our listeners what you see and speak to relevant people, maybe eyewitnesses as well.
Thank you very much for that, Brenda. And today we are speaking about police brutality. So if there's any questions you would like to direct to the Western Cape Provincial Police Ombudsman, Major General Oswald Reddy, as well as to Brenda Leonard, the station manager of Push Radio, feel free to send your questions on 061 862 1065.
And you're still tuned into Saki Sizwe Building the Nation Baudi Nasi. And as you know, today is Tuesday and we were currently having our session with the Bush Radio Advice Office. And today's topic is police brutality. So General Reddy, internal police investigations and departmental disciplinary measures frequently fail to hold officers accountable, with studies showing high rates of case dismissals, there are light punishments, or even protracted delays. So from your perspective, what independent civilian oversight mechanisms like civilian review boards with investigative powers, independent prosecutors for police misconduct cases, or even public transparency requirements have proven most effective in these different contexts?
There are three core models of civilian oversight. And the first one is a review-focused boards. With the review-focused boards, they complete internal police investigation and assess fairness and thoroughness. But the problem is they lack independence because they are internal. The second one is investigative-focused agencies. Now, these are external, much more independent, looking at it from a neutral perspective, listening to both sides of the complaint so that they can then make a fair decision on that. The third one is the auditor-monitor model. And here, the strength is that for effective long-term reform and police improvement, and the example here is the Los Angeles Police Commission. So many countries have external bodies that look into this. But in South Africa, with the police departments, the discipline is dealt with internally. So the oversight bodies like my office, the Western Cape Police Ombudsman, we can only provide recommendations. The police themselves appoint investigating officers who conduct the internal investigation, depending on the nature of the offense. If the offense is minor or petty, they would follow a sort of verbal warning, written warning, those kind of sanctions, remedial work. But if it's serious misconduct, then they have to conduct a full investigation and they bring the matter before a tribunal where there's a police officer appointed to look into the matter, similar to, I would say, a magistrate looking at the evidence against the officer concerned. And then you have the officer's defense. The officer is allowed to bring in a union representative or sometimes even a lawyer in order to defend themselves. And there's cross-examination and re-examination, similar to a court proceeding. The sanctions vary from serious, where you can be dismissed out of the police as a result of that misconduct, or they can take away maybe a month or two of your salary. And there's other sanctions that they can give you as well. So it depends on who handles the matter. But your question focused on the culture of cover-up amongst officers. And that, unfortunately, is commonplace. The reason for that is that there's no standard or minimum standard where people can be held accountable to, including these, we call them trial officers or presiding officers. So if a person commits the same offense in a place like Mitchell's Plain compared to a place like George, you'll find because you have two independent trial officers, the one can give a very lenient sentence, a sanction, and the other can be very harsh. But there's review mechanisms within the system where the sanction then goes through to the provincial commissioner. The provincial commissioner has the final say on whether to uphold the sanction, to review it, or to set it aside and issue alternatives. So that's where the challenge lies. Because it's not completely independent, it can be manipulated in terms of corruption. And if we listen to what's happening again at the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry, you can see the potential. So the way forward in terms of this particular setup is that if you have maybe not really an external body for now in South Africa, but internally if you have a disciplinary unit that deals with all disciplinary serious cases against police officers, which is centralized at a district level, and they then deal with the cases, you'll get much more fairness and equity in sanctions.
Definitely, and thank you so much for expanding a bit more on that.
Yeah, I think from what you're saying, it's clear that we need standards. So it need to be uniformly applied. And I would argue that you do need an outside body so that if you're not happy with the internal process, you can always go to an outside body, like we have the equality courts and so on. But what I wanted to say long ago, I've been at Bush Radio for a long time. And I'm talking about probably about 15 years ago, we had a person come into Bush Radio. He was at the ATM down the road and he was drawing money and the police came and arrested him. And he couldn't understand why they arresting him. He was just withdrawing money. They took him to the Woodstock police station at the time and they started beating him up, including spraying him with tear gas. This is in the cell. He then wanted to make a police case. They refused to make the case at the police station. And I do want us to come back to the point of refusal to take a case, because that's something that comes up, and we're focusing on gender-based violence now. There's sometimes that do happen where they refuse to take a case on gender-based violence or on someone that's been raped. So I think that's an issue we should talk about. But in any case, in this case, he came to Bush because he didn't know where else to go. And as a community radio station, thought, let me go to the community radio station. What we then did is we took photos of him, of the injuries and so on, and then send him, say, go back to the police station. We phoned the station commander, went back, he made a case against police brutality. Took a while, took about 2 years, but the one officer was dismissed. And the other officer got some reprimand. I can't remember what, but the other officer wasn't dismissed. But the one that tear gassed him and hit him in his genitals and so on, that person were dismissed. So I think what I'm saying in a roundabout way is that there's some challenges, but there is a system in place. It took about 2 years. One of our staff members that took the photos even had to go to court to say that they took the photos and this is a true reflection of what they saw. But ultimately, that person, it was a refugee, undocumented, and that's why they didn't want to take the case. So ultimately, that person did get justice. I just wanted to tell that story in terms of this.
General, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, these are the type of cases we investigate as an oversight body. And there's a few of us existing. You have South African Human Rights Commission that looks at that. You have the Public Protector of South Africa. You also have the Parliamentary Oversight Committees. So the media has a vital role to play in exposing these kind of unjust treatment and this brutality. So, if you think about a few years ago, it was very difficult to obtain evidence. If somebody says I was beaten up by the police, you would look for evidence. There's a form called a J88, a medical form that you must take to the doctor and complete. These days, every second or maybe every person has got a cell phone which has got social media. So taking photos, recording incidents, etc. That serves as evidence when we do our investigations, and we are then able to bring those perpetrators to book. So I agree with you that if we sit back and do nothing, the impunity continues. But the moment we take a stand and say enough is enough, this must be reported, then there cannot be a cover-up.
General, I just want to touch further on that, if you can maybe just expand a little bit more, because like you speak about, these days there's smartphones, there is body cams that police basically drive around with. There's the CCTV footage, for instance, and there's social media also. And as media, in some incidents, like, we're not allowed to expose certain stories, but the public is allowed to put anything on social media these days. So when it comes to such cases, more cases of police brutality are being documented and exposed to global audience in real time. And has the unprecedented visibility translated into meaningful accountability, for instance? instance, and prosecutions, especially when it comes to the systematic reforms. In your perspective, when it comes to technology, has it basically merely outpaced the willingness of capability when it comes to institutions basically acting to that evidence that you basically bring forward? Like, what barriers prevents that video evidence from basically being taken into account to get justice for the individual?
If we look at the evidential value of information, it's important when you do investigations, besides a statement, because a statement is a start of a process, that you tell your side of the story of what actually happened, where you will identify the key elements, for example, the date, the time, the place, and then you'll explain what happened. You then are required to provide some sort of evidence or proof. Because most times, if you look at pre-94, the police vehicles didn't have the name of a police station written on it. It didn't have a call sign. So when the new government came in, those were some of the things that they implemented to make it easy for the community to identify police who are deviant in behavior. The other thing was the wearing of the name tags. Many police officers remove their name tags so that they cannot be identified when consequence management is implemented. So these social media, let's call them gadgets for now, because there's all different types. Besides the cell phone, there's CCTV cameras, as you mentioned. There's various ways of getting information, getting evidence. These things are helpful to verify your case, especially if you want to open a criminal case against a police officer, or if you want to institute a civil action and claim against the state, a claim against the police. That assists you to prove your side of the version of what transpired. But some of the challenges on using this material is that for evidence purposes, there has to be a chain. In other words, from the start to the end, the evidence must not be tampered with. So where footage is doctored just to portray one side of the story, and for example, you don't show what you did before the police responded, you just show how the police responded, then that calls into question the integrity of the evidence that you are producing, and that then is not used by the court. So the court wants information that is acceptable in international standards, so that you must be able to explain where you got it from, how you got it, and you must be able to prove that it wasn't tampered with in any way. In most instances, can be used as prima facie evidence of what transpired, especially if you are a victim and someone else records it and it's posted on social media. You then extract it and you use it in your case to prove that this is what happened to me. You couldn't record it because you were the victim, but whatever evidence you have, that is what you utilize. So at a crime scene or at an engagement, you need to record everything. The registration number of the vehicle, the name of the unit that came to do the operation. If you can identify the police officers, which police station do they come from, you have the right to ask that. In the days before 94, the police would come to your house at 2 o'clock in the morning, take you out of bed. Your family don't have a clue where you've been taken to. And the next thing, you disappear. No one hears about you again. We are currently living in a democratic dispensation, and people have rights which are guaranteed by the Constitution. So when the police have to act on information or evidence or intelligence, and they have to violate that right of yours, they have to comply with the law. And at the end of the day, two wrongs cannot make a right. So they have to explain to you who they are. They need to identify themselves, and you have the right to see their appointment certificate to confirm that this is actually a police officer. You also have the right to request a copy of the search warrant. If they're coming to search, you can ask for that. The law allows, in terms of the Criminal Procedure Act, certain circumstances where the police don't need a search warrant. But if they explain that to you and they don't have a search warrant, then you still have the right to take that up with my office or other institutions, and that can be investigated to see what was the reason that they failed to comply with the legal prescripts.
Definitely, and thank you so much for answering that, Major General Reddy. And I found it really interesting that you mentioned tampered evidence, because that does bring into question sort of like ethics when it comes to coverage, right? So, Brenda, I would like to address this next question to you. We know that the media does tend to play a critical role in determining how this police violence is perceived, understood by the public. So, as journalists or as editors and even as media organizations, how can we report responsibly and comprehensively on police brutality while obviously keeping in mind the victim's experiences and providing context about systemic patterns and highlighting injustice without resorting to sensationalism, which is another major issue when it comes to covering these issues, as well as dehumanizing language or just uncritically repeating these police narratives? And what measurable impact does this ethical media coverage and the informed public opinion have on the momentum towards meaningful reform and political action?
That question.
Yep.
I think it's got like 10 components to it. I think let's first talk about police narrative. I think not only police narrative, but the media is very quick to use certain words that doesn't have meaning in the community. I was listening to the retired Major General speaking, and the reality is that the police language are very aggressive. And for us as media, when we report, we need to be aware, cognitive of that, so that we don't fall into the trap of using that aggression in our reporting. So that's the first thing I want to say. I think secondly, the first point I made was about balanced reporting. We have laws in the country, we're a democracy, and this program has dealt with different laws. Last week we dealt with the issue of privacy. There's a law in place about, in criminal cases, whether you can be named or not, the children naming, all of those things still fall into place when you report. So if a police officer is arrested, that means that you still can't name the police officer until that person has appeared in court. Like that person is also the same human rights or Bill of Rights that applies to everyone, every citizen, applies to the police officer as well. And we need to, as media, we need to provide them with that courtesy of giving them also the same respect that we do with everyone. So for me, those are the things. Report in a balanced way. I think if we sensationalize something, I've seen situations in Mitchell's Plain, for instance, quickly you put a spark to a situation and people march to someone's house and they want to burn that house down. So you need to be aware of, as media, the impact of what you can do and what consequences it can create. So to say that person lives there on this street and this is where that person is now, can mobilize communities to go and march, and that's not responsible journalism. I think we need to be responsible in our reporting. I'm not saying we must protect perpetrators, but we have a law in the country and we need to do what we do within that law. So for me, that's the issue. I wanted to come back to something you said about social media. I think last week we also spoke a little bit about social media and the reality as broadcasters, as radio stations, TV stations and so on, we have laws and a code of conduct. We sign to a code of conduct. And if the social media doesn't have a code of conduct, yes, you can complain and maybe they take the post down, but most instances you can post anything on social media. And I think that's where it's got a positive and a negative side for me. The negative side, it can mean you distort the information. It can also mean it leads to consequences that you haven't thought out because you just want to quickly put something on social media because it sensationalizes the issue. But on the other hand, I think social media can play a positive role. I've seen in marches and so on, when people have cameras, the police think about their actions, right? So it keeps them accountable in a way, instead of pushing someone or doing something to someone or tear gassing, they will rather think maybe we must find another form of action. So they sort of, that social media, that camera makes them take a step back. I think you mentioned apartheid, and that wasn't the case under apartheid, because the media were the ones that were firstly pushed out of the way so that there's no record of what violence is going to happen. And now we have a democracy. So there's a little bit, for me, it's positive and negative side of social media.
Thank you very much, Brenda, for expanding a little bit further on that and the use of social media and the role that media needs to play when it comes to sensitivity. So just in conclusion, this question is directed to General Reddy. Like a significant proportion of police violence incidents, basically, and this is something that you touched on earlier when you gave the introduction of the role that police ombudsman basically plays. So police violence incidents basically occurs during interactions with individuals experiencing, for instance, mental health issues, or they might be on substance abuse, psychological distress, or situations where armed officers are, most of the times, they are ill-equipped and have inadequate training how to deal with a situation, for instance. So I just want to know, when it comes to that, like, how can law enforcement agencies collaborate with mental health professionals, for instance, or social workers in that type of situations to handle the situation, and also what alternative response models such as co-responded teams or civilian crisis units are there that basically has demonstrated also successful in events where there is substance abuse, for instance, or mental health cases?
I think that's an important question, because you have hardened criminals who, through intention, commit crime. And then you have those who, either due to substance abuse or mental illness, they cannot control their behavior and they have a sense of aggression. The different types of drugs, for example. If somebody is using cannabis, usually it's a downer, they become very quiet and relaxed and you don't even know that they are around. Compared to someone who is on tuk, that person becomes aggressive and violent. And when you deal with it from a mental health perspective, the laws have reformed significantly in the country, to the extent that families, next of kin or responsible community leaders, etc., can actually report these matters to the local social worker, to the mental health institution. And there's a different process on how these people can be dealt with beyond policing. Policing can come in later, but let's say you, a parent, and your child is on tuk, and this is the behavior that the child is displaying, breaking windows and damaging things in the house. You have the opportunity to approach the court and make an application to send that person through to a mental institution. If the person is violent, then the court can order that the police assist you. But the police are not adequately equipped to deal with those kind of cases. So there's many times where they use straitjackets. But to contain the individual in order to put that straitjacket on is very difficult, because the strength, I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, but sometimes it takes a few people that can't hold this individual down, and that's where the challenge arises. So we have to find alternatives that this individual, before they reach that stage, there must be preventative and positive measures in place to try and get help for the individual. Because it's not a crime per se, but a mental condition that needs help. So you have to look at what's the alternatives that exist in the society. There are various faith-based organizations, NGOs, community-based organizations, and other role players, like you mentioned, DSD, social workers, and the Department of Health, that can come on board and assist. When the police comes in, it's difficult because many times the police carry lethal weapons. So when you are confronting someone who is unharmed but aggressive, or they pick up a weapon and they now want to attack you because of the state of mind, it's very difficult to utilize your firearm, for example, to try and contain the situation. So there has to be alternative measures in place, and that is why the police were issued with rubber bullets, for example, to try and contain the situation. And pepper spray is also issued to police officers, but sometimes with the drug problem and the pepper spray, it actually aggravates the situation. So you, as an officer on the beat and as local communities, you have to weigh that situation to ensure that it doesn't escalate out of control. You need to try and contain it through being calm and treating people in a proper manner so that you can try and deal with the medical problem, because it is not necessarily a criminal matter until that engagement, and now it becomes a serious offense where someone can lose their life.
Thank you very much, General, for the clarity around that and also giving the explanation around how to handle mental health situations. So just for our listeners that is listening right now, how can they make contact with the Western Cape Provincial Police Ombudsman, for instance, or your department if they do have further queries?
We have a website. If they go online, they will see Western Cape Police Ombudsman. They can lodge complaints or make inquiries through the website. Our telephone number is 021 483 0669. Let me repeat, 021 483 0669. We have an office in St. George's Mall. It's at the Waldorf building, and many people come through directly to our office to come and lodge complaints. So you reach out and we will be able to assist you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to our panelists for the insights on this deeply important issue. And that also concludes today's edition of Sakisi's We're Building the Nation, Bodinasi.